Opening the center immediately creates diagonal tension, inviting a rapid development of pieces to control the crucial central squares. Instantly mirroring white's pawn advances, this central foothold establishes equality and prepares for an immediate pawn duel. Developing the knight to f3 immediately challenges the central pawn and prepares for castling, setting a dynamic tone. Developing the knight to its natural square, defending the pawn, and preparing for rapid queenside development sets a solid foundation. Developing towards the king's flank, this bishop immediately eyes the vulnerable f7 square, a classic strategic maneuver in this opening. Asserting influence on the f2 pawn, this placement creates immediate diagonal pressure and prepares for potential kingside maneuvers. Reinforcing the d4 square, this subtle development aims for a flexible pawn center and prepares to contest central control. Developing a knight towards the center here pressures white's pawn and prepares for kingside castling, a sound strategic choice. Solidifying the center while preparing for piece development, this move prioritizes a robust pawn structure and avoids premature commitments. Solidifying the pawn chain, this quiet placement prepares for a more robust central presence and potentially opens lines for the queen's bishop. Developing the bishop to a more active square, this establishes a robust fianchetto-like formation with the knight, aiming to control central squares and prepare for potential kingside pawn advances while maintaining king safety. Exchanging bishops here immediately alters the pawn structure, creating doubled pawns for white and potentially opening lines for black's pieces down the future. This decision signals a shift towards positional maneuvering, prioritizing the destruction of white's pawn phalanx over immediate tactical skirmishes. Now, black should look to exploit the weakened light squares on white's kingside. Opening the f-file for your rook, this pawn capture reshapes the central pawn structure and prepares for aggressive play on that open avenue, though it does create a doubled pawn for white. Seeking an outpost for the knight, black aims to reposition it to c4, a potentially disruptive square if white isn't careful, while simultaneously preparing to develop their queenside. The bishop retreats, conceding the central outpost and preparing to rejoin the attack on the queenside. Trading that knight for a pawn opens up the file for your rook, creating immediate pressure against white's isolated e-pawn. This decision prioritizes active piece play and long-term structural advantages over material equality, aiming to exploit the imbalance. Instantly establishing an open file, this capture reshapes the pawn structure, creating potential weaknesses on the queenside while simultaneously preparing for queen activity down the file. Unleashing a knight to g4 immediately questions the pawn structure and targets the vulnerable f2 square, creating fascinating tactical possibilities and forcing white to be extremely vigilant about their king's safety. Unifying the rooks and preparing to challenge the open file, this maneuver reclaims initiative while reinforcing central pawn structure. Reinforcing the central pawn structure with f6 aims to solidify black's kingside pawn chain and prepare for potential pawn advances, though it weakens the dark squares around the king and sacrifices some immediate piece activity. Exploiting the central tension, white throws a pawn forward to challenge black's entire structure and aim for a significant space advantage, potentially opening lines for active pieces. Solidifying the center with a pawn push, black aims to create a more robust pawn chain and potentially launch a counterattack on the kingside. Unleashing the queenside potential, white boldly castles queenside, initiating a daring race against black's king. This aggressive maneuver immediately signals an intent to exploit the open files and create immediate threats against black's king, which remains stubbornly in the center. The doubled pawns on the f-file, while a potential weakness, are now actively supported by the rook, ready to spearhead an assault. This is a sharp positional gamble, prioritizing attacking chances over structural purity, and inviting a battle of nerves where the player who best navigates the incoming storm will likely prevail. Proactively seeking active squares for the queen, black's decision to relocate it to e7 simultaneously prepares for potential pawn pushes in the center, and shores up the kingside against white's looming threats on the open files. Challenging black's advanced knight, White proactively addresses the potential foray of the dark-squared horse further into the kingside territory. This move not only creates a safe haven for the king by clearing the third rank, but also subtly prepares for a potential kingside pawn storm by opening up avenues for further development. It's a move that prioritizes king's safety while simultaneously seeking to gain space and initiative. The knights retreat to the edge of the board, while seemingly passive, might be aiming to reroute towards a more active square later, or perhaps it's a defensive maneuver to protect against any immediate threats on the kingside. Considering the pawn structure, especially white's doubled f-pawns, black is trying to develop piece activity to compensate for any potential weaknesses, even if it means temporarily sacrificing kingside presence. This kind of maneuvering often sets the stage for positional battles where small advantages accumulate. White advances the kingside pawn chain, aiming to cramp black's knight and potentially open lines toward the king. This developing piece finds a quiet, defensive haven, preparing to reinforce the kingside and connect the rooks while subtly aiming to contest the central d4 pawn's influence. Initiating a daring knight sortie towards the kingside, aiming to exploit the exposed black king while simultaneously preparing to push the h-pawn, thereby gaining a crucial foothold on the g-file. Preparing a kingside pawn storm by advancing the g-pawn creates weaknesses around the black king. Reclaiming the central square, this knight repositions to bolster the d4 pawn and prepare for potential advances on the kingside, subtly shifting the focus from passive defense to more active control. The knight's retreat to f7 signals a significant positional shift, subtly reinforcing the kingside structure and preparing for a potential kingside pawn storm or a redeployment towards the queenside if circumstances allow, all while keeping a watchful eye on the central squares. Initiating a powerful kingside pawn storm with the rook's repositioning signals white's aggressive intent, aiming to dismantle black's pawn structure and create attacking avenues for the monarch. Embarking on the queenside castle marks a pivotal decision, acknowledging the inherent danger to the king on the kingside. By tucking the monarch away, black aims to secure his royal figure, albeit at the cost of momentarily neglecting central control and potentially leaving the queenside pawns exposed to future white advances. This defensive maneuver, however, sets the stage for a strategic battle where both kings find themselves on opposite sides of the board, a classic scenario ripe for sharp, attacking play. The unleashed h-file from white's earlier pawn push now becomes a potential highway for white's attack, a factor black must keenly monitor. Embracing the initiative, white lunges forward on the queenside, disrupting black's pawn structure and aiming to seize open lines for future pressure. This pawn push isn't just about territorial gain. It's a declaration of intent to dominate the queenside flank and potentially isolate black's rooks. The black king, having found a temporary haven on b8, now braces for the inevitable storm brewing on the kingside. This retreat signifies a shift in black's priorities, from active piece play to a more defensive posture, seeking to weather white's ambitious pawn thrusts and the opening of the file. Shifting the queen to this square aims to exert influence over the kingside advance, but it might also leave the queen exposed to potential counterplay along the newly opened files once the pawn storm truly begins. The rook's placement on f8 is a patient buildup, aiming to reinforce the kingside and prepare for a potential pawn storm later, while also eyeing the now exposed f-file. It's a subtle but important defensive fortification against white's looming pawn advances on the queenside. White repositions the queen, aiming to coordinate with the rook on the g-file and potentially launch an attack on black's kingside, while also preparing to support pawn advances. Shaping the pawn structure creates a potential weakness around the king, but also aims to prevent an immediate pawn storm from the rook and knight. Bringing the rook into central play, the idea is to activate this piece on the half-open f-file, creating potential attacking avenues towards black's king or offering a defensive pivot if needed. Black's knight, previously pinned to its king on f7, now seeks refuge and a new lease on life by repositioning to d8, potentially supporting a future pawn push or even swinging over to the kingside, a subtle but critical maneuver for defensive restructuring. Initiating a rook lift to the third rank, This maneuver anticipates a potential kingside attack or a powerful central advance, while simultaneously reinforcing the g-file. Pivoting the knight to a more active square opens up possibilities for central counterplay, and potentially reinforces the kingside defense against white's kingside pawn storm brewing. White marshals forces towards the kingside, eyeing a potential pawn storm with g4 and h3 already advanced, though the open f-file might invite counterplay. Initiating a maneuver to fortify the kingside and potentially establish a more active outpost for the knight on the kingside. Reinforcing the central pawn structure and preparing to challenge the open f-file, this redeployment aims to consolidate white's position and potentially launch an offensive. Opening up the h-file for black's rook on g8, 24. Our fg8 signals an intention to challenge white's central pawn structure and perhaps initiate some aggressive play on that side of the board, looking to exploit any weaknesses that might arise from white's doubled pawns. Shifting the knight towards the kingside aims to disrupt black's pawn structure or create new attacking possibilities, but it feels a bit slow given the locked center and the existing queenside castling. The knight's repositioning to e8 prepares a potential rerouting, perhaps aiming towards the queenside to support pawn advances or to escape the now rather exposed kingside. Initiating a pawn storm to fracture black's defenses and seize crucial territory, this advance seeks to pry open the queenside before black can consolidate their position. The king, now somewhat exposed with the pawn structure on the kingside weakened, seeks a safer haven, sidestepping any immediate threats that might arise from the open files and the advanced white pawns. Cracking open the queenside pawns aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and create attacking avenues, but it also exposes white's own king to potential counterplay down the newly opened lines. Opening the b-file with this recapture drastically alters the pawn structure, creating potential weaknesses for black on the queenside squares c6 and c7, while simultaneously offering white's rook an avenue for activity. Shifting the knight to a more central square, f3, prepares for an offensive thrust or defensive repositioning, aiming to activate this piece from its somewhat passive placement on h4. An aggressive pawn thrust, intent on shattering the symmetry and creating diagonal pressure. This daring advance initiates a bold pawn storm, aiming to disrupt white's castled king by opening lines. It sacrifices immediate pawn structure integrity for potential attacking chances on the kingside, a risky proposition given white's already advanced pawns and the looming queenside majority. The move forces white to make a decision, either accept the pawn sacrifice and potentially expose their own king, or retreat and allow black to consolidate their attack. The entire game hinges on whether this gambit pays off, potentially leading to a decisive assault or a structural breakdown for black. Consolidating the rook pressure on the g-file, a subtle repositioning that prepares for future breakthroughs by avoiding passive observation. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside now, 29. h5 aims to dismantle white's already compromised pawn shield and expose their castled king to immediate danger, leveraging the open diagonal for the queen and bishop. The doubled pawns on the b-file, a consequence of white's earlier pawn structure choices, now become a significant strategic consideration, potentially hindering piece mobility and creating a weakness that black might exploit with timely pawn breaks or piece incursions. A bid to create counterplay on the queenside, attempting to undermine white's newly established pawn majority, but potentially leaving the king exposed to a swift attack along the h-file should white consolidate. A vital repositioning of the monarch to secure the king's flank from further encroachment and prepare for potential defensive or offensive operations along the newly cleared diagonal. The rook's journey to the 8th rank, a daring repositioning under the watchful eyes of white's monarch, signals a shift from passive defense to active counterplay, aiming to disrupt the established pawn structure and introduce complications. The queen's repositioning on f2 finally offers a moment of tactical reevaluation, aiming to control the f-file and prepare for potential central breakthroughs or support for the kingside pawn storm that has been building for quite some time. Re-establishing the knight on its c7 outpost promises to shore up the queenside defenses and prepare for potential counterplay by blocking the c-file's penetration. Suddenly, the rook emerges from its defensive post, seeking an active role on the queen side, potentially aiming to disrupt black's newly established pawn chain or prepare for a queenside pawn advance. The rook's relocation to b8 ignites pressure along the open b-file, potentially aiming to pry open lines or support a d-pawn advance, all while creating a more active defense for the king on the queen side. This maneuver seeks to reposition the queen to a more dynamic square, eyeing potential weaknesses on the queen side, and preparing to support a pawn advance or piece redeployment on that flank. Re-establishing the defensive pawn chain along the c-file, the rook on b7 prepares to potentially swing over to the kingside to shore up defenses or perhaps rejoin the queenside action, anticipating white's maneuvering. Repositioning the rook to the g-file, white aims to create pressure and potential attacking avenues against black's weakened kingside pawn structure, while also preparing for future rook lifts or exchanges to simplify and potentially gain an endgame advantage. Shifting the rook's attention to the queenside now, hinting at potential pawn advances or simply repositioning for better defensive coverage against white's kingside expansion. Shifting the rook to the d-file initiates a strategic repositioning, preparing to potentially double rooks on open or semi-open files, exerting pressure along the d-file, and creating a more dynamic defensive and offensive setup, especially if the central pawn structure were to become more fluid or if black commits to a decisive pawn advance. Embracing chaos often unlocks hidden avenues. This capture disrupts the pawn chain, potentially opening the h-file for immediate pressure, but it also creates a structural weakness that could become a target if white reacts intelligently. Consider the counterplay this unleashes against your own monarch's exposed flank. Opening the h-file, even with pawns still on the board, immediately targets the enemy monarch's safety, forcing a reevaluation of its current protective structure. The rook now establishes a crucial outpost on c8, aiming to penetrate the c-file and potentially challenge white's queenside structure which, while solid, now has doubled pawns that could become targets. Shifting the queen to the d-file injects immediate pressure, aiming to exploit the now open central files and potentially prepare for pawn breakthroughs or piece activity on that side of the board. Unleashing the bishop to e6 opens up a diagonal for potential counterplay against white's king, while simultaneously reinforcing the pawn chain on the queen side and contesting the central squares with renewed purpose. Initiating a pawn storm on the queen side with that knight lift signals a significant shift in white's strategy, aiming to generate dynamic play and disrupt black's entrenched position. Sensing an opportunity on the queen side, black boldly ventures their knight to the 5th rank, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially launch an attack against the exposed white king. Reinforcing the central knight's stability becomes paramount as white seeks to re-establish dynamic play, acknowledging the congested queenside pawns. Navigating the dense pawn structure, black aims to consolidate the queenside and potentially prepare a subtle advance, but might overlook white's potential for a coordinated kingside assault with the repositioned knight and open files. Targeting the queenside with a pawn thrust, aims to disrupt black's defensive structure and potentially open lines for white's rook operations. The rook retreats, seeking a more active post on the 7th rank, though its placement on b7 feels somewhat passive, a mere spectator to the unfolding drama on the kingside. A king's repositioning to a more secure square, potentially preparing for a pawn storm push on the queenside or seeking refuge from potential piece activity on the kingside. Shifting the rook to the open file offers a subtle yet crucial repositioning, aiming to disrupt white's centralized control and prepare for potential pawn breaks on the queenside. Preparing a surprise raid down the g-file, the rook repositions itself to a more active square, eyeing potential breakthroughs. The rook on d7 seeks to participate in the fight for the d-file, potentially supporting a pawn push or challenging white's rook there. Unlocking the queenside pawn chain provides a crucial avenue for expansion, potentially disrupting black's defensive setup and creating threats that demand immediate attention. Black repositions the knight, aiming to create attacking possibilities on the king side or potentially a regrouping towards the queen side depending on white's response. Striking at the center with this pawn thrust immediately challenges black's pawn structure and opens diagonal lines. Opening the central file decisively, black seeks to shatter white's pawn structure and create counterplay, a bold gambit given the precarious state of their king. Unlocking the d-file offers a critical pathway for white's rook to infiltrate black's queenside, aiming to exploit the vulnerable structure created by the pawn capture. Sensing an opportunity, black seeks to activate the bishop from its passively defensive posture on the queen side, hoping to create counterplay and contest the open c-file. Initiating a decisive pawn thrust on the queen's flank, white aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and open lines for potential piece activity, potentially isolating the knight on c7. Challenging the queenside pawn structure with a rook outpost is a desperate attempt to revive the initiative, but it overlooks the immediate threat of white's dominant central pawns and the open d-file. Seeking safety for the monarch amidst the board's chaos, the king sidesteps the immediate threat, aiming to regroup and potentially find solace on the queen side, away from the storm brewing on the king side. The initiative shifts dramatically as black repositions the rook, aiming to exploit the open file and create potential mating threats along the 7th rank. Sharpening the central pawn thrust, this ambitious advance immediately seeks to pry open the d-file and activate white's long-dormant queen, aiming to exploit the black king's exposed position amidst the cramped defensive setup. Seeking to untangle its pieces and finally activate the queen's rook, black endeavors to open a path for the b8 rook, perhaps aiming for a queenside invasion or a maneuver to bolster the beleaguered king's defense. Opening up a fresh avenue for the rook towards the queenside, a strategic repositioning that seeks to exploit the now open b-file and potentially create new attacking ideas, while simultaneously maintaining defensive coverage of the d-pawn. Rerouting the rook to the central files seems like a sensible defensive maneuver, preparing to challenge white's control over the d-file and potentially offer support to the isolated pawn on e4 should it become a target. Reactivating the f-file thrusts the rook into a more aggressive stance, aiming to exploit potential weaknesses around black's castled king. The bishop's retreat to h7, while seemingly passive, aims to reposition it to a more active diagonal, potentially eyeing the kingside or reinforcing the defense. It's a quiet regrouping, prioritizing piece safety and future potential over immediate action, which is often a wise strategy in this congested central position. Initiating a critical piece sacrifice to unravel black's defensive pawn structure and open lines towards the king. The rook's forced retreat leaves the dark squares around the king dangerously weak, inviting a swift white assault through the open diagonals. The rook's repositioning creates an immediate threat to black's queen, forcing a reaction and potentially opening lines for white's attack. The queen's capture of the rook sacrifices material, but aims to create an immediate tactical crisis, leveraging the discovered attack threat on white's unsupported king. The queen's interception seizes the critical 7th rank, creating immediate pressure on the black rook and disrupting any hopes of a coordinated defense. The black queen, stranded on its back rank, now finds itself directly exposed to the white queen's crushing attack. Unleashing a devastating discovered check, white forcibly repositions the queen to exploit the vulnerable black king's precarious position, initiating a decisive mating sequence. Black's rook, having been a bit of a spectator, now endeavors to weave its way back into the fray by tucking itself behind the pawn chain. A masterful repositioning, aiming to exploit the newly opened diagonals and centralize the knight for maximum pressure on the queen side. Recognizing the imminent mate threat, black attempts to create a barrier, hoping to deflect the queen's assault, but the king's exposed position remains a significant liability. The queen sacrifice ushers in a forced sequence that aims to exploit black's exposed king and weakened pawn structure, aiming to simplify into a winning endgame. The king, now exposed to a barrage of enemy pieces after the pawn storm on the queen side subsided, desperately seeks refuge, but the open lines offer no solace. Unleashing the queen on the diagonal forces a concession, tightening the noose around black's king as the pawn structure crumbles.